Hello, and welcome to this evening's talk by Professor Justin Jacobs on what has turned out to be quite a wild and windy night here in Hong Kong. My name is Tina Pang, and I'm president of the Oriental Ceramic Society of Hong Kong. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our friends and members in Hong Kong, and to those of you who may be joining from elsewhere, in particular members of the OCS in London. While we've been unable to hold physical events for much of this year, I'm thrilled that we're able to bring you this lecture by Professor Jacobs, which we hope will be the first of many. In the months to come, I'm particularly pleased to announce that we will be presenting a series of 5 lectures, postponed from last year, by Professor Peter Lam on the history of Chinese ceramics with an emphasis on archaeological finds in Hong Kong. Details of these and more information about the Society are available on our website, a link to which you will find in the Q&A box. I'm now pleased to pass over to Vice President Renee Chang, who will introduce Professor Jacobs and the topic of this evening's lecture. Should you have any questions for Professor Jacobs, please just post them in the chat, and time willing, we'll try to address them at the end. Thank you, and enjoy the talk.
Thank you all for joining us. My name is Renee Chang, and I'm with the OCS of Hong Kong. Today, we are pleased to bring you a lecture by Professor Justin Jacobs on a topic that is almost a century old, but is still controversial. Mark Stein, Paul Pelio, Langdon Warner. These names are probably familiar to most of our members because they have been lionized for their contributions to the great museums of the West. But in China, these same men are vilified as thieves, or maybe even enemies of the Chinese people. And for the same reason, for having removed thousands of ancient Buddhist manuscripts, frescoes, and statues from the caves of Dunhuang in Northwestern China. Is there any way to reconcile or make sense of these competing narratives? Today, Professor Jacobs brings historical clarity to this issue. In his book on today's topic, The Compensations of Plunder, which was published this year by University of Chicago Press, he suggests a new framework by which to understand what really happened. Professor Jacobs teaches at American University in Washington, D.C. He is an historian of China, specializing in the history of Xinjiang and archaeological excavations. Other books he has published include Xinjiang and the Modern Chinese State and Indiana Jones in History. He is also the editor of the Silk Road Journal and hosts a podcast called Beyond Huaxia. Thank you, Professor Jacobs, for getting up so early to speak to us today.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk about the subject of my book. It's bright and early on the East Coast of the United States. I hope wherever you are, that you are ready to enjoy my discussion of the research that I've been doing over the past 15 years. So I'll begin with the next slide. I want to begin actually by talking about how this project came out of the research for what is actually my first book, which was the research from my dissertation. Can we get the next slide up there? I'm sorry, this is the obviously the cover of the current book that I'm talking about. Next slide after this. This book came out of the research for my first book, as Renee mentioned there a minute ago, Xinjiang and the Modern Chinese State. And to understand how I got to this topic, originally I started off trying to understand how the Chinese had managed to maintain unbroken political control over the largest non-Han minority region of the former Qing Empire in the 20th century. Next slide. And the backdrop, if any of you are not familiar with this region of China, the backdrop is Xinjiang, usually translated into English as the New Territories, which today comprises about 1/6 of the territory of the People's Republic of China. This is the area where you have a substantial percentage of Muslim Turkic-speaking Uyghurs in the south, in the oases along the Taklamakan Desert, nomadic Kazakhs in the north, a smattering of Mongols. About 5% of the population in the beginning of the 20th century was Han, and they were mostly in the Qing official bureaucracy. Next slide. What I tried to understand is, how did the Han rulers, who comprise such a small minority of this land, how did they manage to preserve their political control over a non-Chinese region? And so what I eventually found is that they had evolving methods of rule. Here you see an official, Che Yuheng, with his Muslim begs, a small sliver of the local population who was brought into the Chinese administration. And as the 20th century progressed, the Chinese officials adopted more of a desire or a need to incorporate more of the Uyghurs and Kazakhs into the local government. Next slide. Now, I'm not going to talk about the entire argument of that book. I simply want to bring this up to show how I ended up getting interested in the archaeologists who came from foreign lands into Xinjiang in the first half of the 20th century. And what I found is, as I'm trying to uncover ground level perspectives in Xinjiang of just what's going on, the political situation, I found out that many of these foreign archaeologists were actually some of the best ground level eyewitnesses. Here you see the Swedish explorer Sven Hedin with Sheng Shicai in the 1930s. And so I started to think maybe these guys left behind field diaries in which they record various impressions of the local situation that I don't always see in the Chinese sources. Maybe they comment on different types of things. And to my surprise, when I started looking at the field diaries and letters of these explorers and archaeologists who came into Xinjiang, originally I was looking for political observations. I began to find that there were seemingly counterintuitively positive impressions of the foreign explorers from both the Chinese officials and many of the Muslim subjects of the region. And this surprised me because I only sort of vaguely knew, as Renee was mentioning, that later on they will all be regarded as thieves who stole innumerable art and antiquity from China. Next slide. And so I started to wonder, how do I account for these seemingly positive impressions of the foreign explorers that I'm seeing in their diaries? So my new research question was, instead of trying to understand how the Chinese preserved political control over a non-Han land in my first book, I started to ask the question, how did they lose cultural control over the antiquities that were buried beneath that exact same soil? And here you're seeing a photo from 1922 in Khotan. This is an example of the type of art that many of you are probably familiar with that first attracted the Western explorers and archaeologists such as Stein and Paleo into Xinjiang. They were looking for what we now refer to as Gandharan art, a mix of Buddhist and Indian influences with Greek artistic styles as well. But eventually they found Chinese materials also as they undertook their expeditions. Next slide. Now, Oral Stein was by far the most important of all the foreign archaeologists. Here you see him here with Kashgar magistrate Pan Zuhan in 1930 during his fourth expedition. He was the most important because he did the most number of expeditions, 4 different expeditions from 1900 to 1930, 2 in the late Qing, 1 right after the 1911 revolution, and 1 in 1930. And he the greatest amount of materials. So I knew if I was going to start looking at foreign explorers, you had to look at them all, but Stein clearly was going to be the most important one. So next slide. I first identified where his papers were. Where did he leave all of his materials before he died? And most of them, the bulk of his diaries and letters, not all of them, but the bulk of his diaries and letters were left at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And here you're seeing examples. There are tens of thousands of pages. Stein was extremely meticulous. Now, when I went to the Bodleian Library over several different research trips, I actually ended up finding a gold mine of new source materials that I never expected to find. Next slide. These were archival materials in Chinese. I went to the archives thinking that I would only find English language materials and it would simply be a supplement to the Chinese archival materials that I found elsewhere. And this is box number 341. This was sort of the treasure trove for me, filled with Chinese language materials that Stein had collected during his expeditions. Next slide. And when you open up this box, what I was simply amazed at what I found. I had no idea that he had saved these sorts of materials. They give you a ground level impression of how the local officials interacted with him, how they announced his expedition to the locals. Here you're seeing an announcement that would be posted up, announcing to the local population that Stein is coming. Here is what he is going to do, and these sorts of things, various envelopes. Next slide. This is a wonderful documentation of a ground level perspective, oftentimes from the Chinese perspective. And it's also clear, this is a list of Chinese officials. I found this for 2 different expeditions, that Stein, as the other explorers did, placed a very high importance on his relationship with Chinese officials. Their help was essential for the logistics of an archaeological expedition. He himself admitted time and time again, if the Chinese officials don't go out of their way to lend their enthusiastic assistance, I could not complete these expeditions. Next slide. And so you get a really intimate look at how he interacted with the Chinese officials through the Chinese language documentation that he kept in his archives. This slide here, this is an entire folder, and I've unfolded it here, and it's a huge stack of red Chinese calling cards. When you're going to call upon a new Chinese magistrate when you enter the district, you have to give him your card. Sidai Nuo, this is his name, Stein, translated into Chinese. He kept all of the calling cards of every single official that he met and had a whole stack of those in his own name as well. Next slide. And so you go through this, and you have the remarkable ability in Stein's archives to correlate the exact officials he met, know that he met them because he has their calling card, and then correlate it with the materials you're finding in his diary, and then other Chinese materials as well. Now, all the political and social interactions that the archaeologist had with the local Chinese officials meant that they often met with them multiple times. All right, so what I found is that the Chinese officials and the foreign archaeologists saw themselves as rare social and political equals who were different than the lower class subjects who often they regarded at the time as being beneath them in both political and social status. Next slide. Oftentimes when I was going through these calling cards, you could correlate the exact official with photos that Stein had taken at other times as well. Here is the exact same official that I showed in the earlier slide. This is from Stein's book from his second expedition, and there is indeed Che Yuheng's calling card, which obviously Stein collected and then preserved in his archives as well. Next slide. And what I also found in the archives is an interesting phenomenon where it seemed that officials were exchanging photos with Stein. Now, this was something that surprised me at first. There were a lot of photos of the officials that Stein met that Stein didn't take. That these officials already had, and they gave it to Stein as a gift. So I was wondering, why are they sending photos to one another? There clearly is more than meets the eye. Next slide. And indeed, there was a lot more than meets the eye. This was just the tip of the iceberg. The real treasures were the letters, the Chinese language letters that the local officials wrote to Stein. They weren't just sending him photographs. They weren't just giving him his calling cards. They were writing him not just sort of simple 2 or 3 lines, it was nice to meet you, sort of a thing. These are extensive letters with significant detail. And when I saw these, this one in particular from Zhu Reicher to Stein, when I saw this sort of stuff, this is when I started to realize, okay, I think I've got an entire research project here because I'm getting unmediated, direct Chinese voices of what they thought about Stein, written directly to Stein right after they met him. Next slide. So this is a letter from Zhu Reicher to Stein, and then you also have it in other parts of his archives. You have pictures. This is Zhu Reicher again, sitting in the center with Stein on the right. In 1915, Stein met Zhu Reicher on 3 of his 4 expeditions, and later on, when he met Zhu Reicher in 1915, in his diary, he even says, I met Magistrate Zhu, I was welcomed, and he even writes this line, even though he did not know Chinese, he learned it very rudimentarily. He wrote in his diary, welcomed as a Lao Pengyo, an old friend. Now, in that letter that you just saw that Zhu had written to Stein, it's not just sort of casual pleasantries. He also goes into great detail about what he admires in Stein. In that letter, he has lines where he says, "You set your foot becomes famous, from the luster that you confer on the peaks of the Kunlun mountains to the distinction that you confer on the sands of the Gobi." He says, I admire the fortitude and stern resolve that you have in venturing out into the wilds to recover traces of Chinese antiquity. Next slide. And it was clear that even though Stein was not fluent in Chinese, that he placed great importance on these letters, and he made an attempt to understand what they said. And he continued the correspondence. This wasn't an impediment. Here is an English translation, a crude English translation that Stein was able to commission of that exact same letter from Zhu Reichi. This is the exact same letter that you saw 2 slides ago in red, that written on the red paper. It's a crude translation, but you do get the gist of what Zhu was saying to Stein. And Stein, as you can find in his archives, he was so meticulous, he saved everything. He has his letters that he wrote back. So he maintained a substantive social relationship with these officials before, during, and after his expeditions. Next slide. Zhu Reichi was simply the one who had one of the most fantastic and revealing of all the letters, but there were many different officials, such as this one. A little bit harder to read. I had to have this one transcribed before I was actually able to fully translate it, because it's written in a very flowing script. This is Li Shurong, the magistrate of Zhenxi, or Barakal, another small town in Xinjiang, a little bit north of Hami. Stein met Li Shurong, and over a period of 6 days, I was able to document in his diary, he met Li Shurong 7 times over 6 days. This is not simply, I have to pay a courtesy call on the magistrate once, and then I'll go do my expedition. There is a substantive relationship that was forming here between the foreign explorers and the local officials. Next slide. And this is just sort of the last letter that I'll give you an example of. There are many more in the archives, and I examine these in depth in the book. This one is from Carrier Magistrate Dai Cheng Mo, who Stein met in 1913. We have this short letter in which he's basically bragging. Dai Cheng Mo is bragging that he's been all over the world. He's traveled through Europe, and I've met so many talented people, but none of them measure up to Stein, who is one of the greatest scholars I've ever met. It is a gushing letter of admiration. And so we have the Chinese voices, and then I can supplement this with Stein's diary accounts, the accounts he has at the time, where he then gives his impression of Dai Cheng Mo, and they're also quite positive. Next slide. So, armed with these letters, I decided, all right, I think I need to try to reevaluate the local relationships that the foreign archaeologists maintained and cultivated, first with the Chinese officials, who were so important for these expeditions, but with everyone. The Muslim laborers who provided the actual labor for the expeditions. The Chinese laborers when he gets to Gansu, and it's no longer the Uyghurs, and he hires local Chinese peasants. The Mongols when they're in Inner Mongolia. All these different perspectives. And so I begin with the first foreign expeditions that began in the late Qing. Here is one of the passports that Stein had for his second expedition from the Qing dynasty that begins in 1906. Next slide. And I decided I'm going to begin with those expeditions of all the foreign explorers, although Stein and Paleo predominate. They also leave behind the most materials. And I end the narrative in 1930 with Stein's final expedition. This is his passport for his fourth expedition from the Kuomintang, from the nationalist government, in 1930. And by this point, everything is starting to change. You are getting Chinese condemnations in some quarters by this point, not all quarters, but in some quarters that are calling him, excuse me, that are calling him a thief. So in the last 15, 20 minutes that I have here, I just sort of want to give you a summary of my major findings, which of course are expounded at much greater length and with more evidence in the actual book itself. And what I'm trying to do here, what's very important to me, is that I don't just analyze the situation in China and say this is what I see in China. I've also compared and contrasted this with what I've found in Western archaeological expeditions around the world. So I can compare the situation in China with the situation in the Ottoman Empire. And you're seeing similar trends in which you have surprisingly significant local cooperation with Western archaeologists, not just cooperation, but effuse admiration and enthusiastic assistance before World War I. And then everything changes after World War I, and throughout the world, the first discourse of criminalization, calling Western archaeologists, and in the case of China, Japanese archaeologists as well, calling them thieves. That appears for the very first time in the 1920s. Prior to the 1920s, never once in any Chinese language source documentation did I ever find, the Chinese words for plunder, for theft. It's always neutral verbs, carry, transport, when they're describing how these things are removed from the country. So next slide. I'm going to illustrate this first through some examples outside of China, and then we'll illustrate them with examples inside of China. This is a painting of the removal of the marbles by men hired by Lord Elgin in the early 19th century from the Parthenon in Athens. And what I'm finding here is my basic argument that comes out of the source material in China is that local officials and local people who are on foreign archaeological expeditions, they are receiving one of four forms of capital, all right, capital, that they basically exchange for art and antiquities that they deem of lesser value than what they're getting in return from the foreign archaeologist. What form of capital are we talking about? Political capital, social capital, economic capital, and here, diplomatic capital. Diplomatic capital is perhaps one of the most common forms of capital, in which basically what you're seeing is empires or states that are less developed and less wealthy than the European and North American countries who send these archaeologists. They basically say, we'll give you all the help you need and we'll let you remove whatever you want in exchange for diplomatic concessions of some sort, or assistance in areas that normally you wouldn't give us. It's very expensive, but we want to do this to sort of sweeten the diplomatic deal. And the backdrop for the Elgin marbles is actually the fact that France, Napoleon, had invaded Egypt, a province of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans want to get back their province of Egypt, but they can't defeat the French on their own. The British, for their own selfish reasons, want to kick the French out of Egypt. They do so, and it's right as the British kicked the French out of Egypt that the Sultan in Constantinople tells Elgin, who is the ambassador, the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, he says, as thanks, essentially, I will give you a firman, a written document that allows you to do whatever you want in Athens. We're culturally disconnected from these antiquities. We don't value them like you do. They have some value, but not the high value that the Westerners place on them. And I see the Elgin marbles as a form of diplomatic capital, but you can't understand that unless you reconstruct the entire geopolitical context of the time frame in which this stuff is being removed. Next slide. The next couple of slides are examples in Egypt. These ancient obelisks, known colloquially as Cleopatra's Needles. These were things that were given successively by different Egyptian pashas, the local de facto autonomous ruler in Egypt, at various points over the 19th century. They were essentially given as diplomatic gifts, again, to sweeten diplomatic deals. These don't have a very high value to us. We can see you guys place a very high value on them. They're essentially free. I can give it to you as a gift, as thanks, or as an incentive for a new trade deal, lower taxes, to get your assistance when we want to negotiate with the French. Here you're seeing a Cleopatra's Needle that was gifted to the United States. It ended up in Central Park in New York, where it still is today. Next slide. The next slide shows you Cleopatra's Needle. There were three of them eventually. I believe this one is in Paris. There was also a Cleopatra's Needle in London, which I've seen actually all three of these now. I've sort of checked them off when I was doing research for this project. Next slide. Another example of diplomatic capital, it's so common, and it actually is still something that you see today, is the Temple of Dendur from Egypt, which was going to be flooded, I believe, by a new dam project in Egypt. The United States lent engineering assistance, and as thanks for the U.S. assistance with the dam and the flooding, the government of Egypt essentially gifted the Temple of Dendur to the United States, and it's now been reconstructed in the Metropolitan Museum. All right, next slide. Now let's get to a more specific Chinese example. In the year 1905, as part of the reform of the Qing during its last decade in power, the Qing dynasty sent a group of officials to tour Europe and America to examine their constitutions, how China might reform itself during the era of the new policies, the Xinjiang. And as part of this, one thing that happened is the very famous antiquities collector Dunhuang When he went to Chicago, he visited the Field Museum, which was relatively new back then in 1905, and he gave a gift of an ancient Taoist stele, ancient Chinese Taoist stele, to the museum. This is, again, a form of diplomatic capital in which he's trying to improve the impression that the local officials have of him, and he willingly gifts a form of art and antiquity in exchange for diplomatic capital. Next slide. Now we get even more specific, not just China, but we can start looking at the expeditions themselves and the research materials that I've found. I apologize for this. I scanned this out of my own photocopy, so it still has all of my notes. It's quite messy here. This is a style of Chinese. It's not Baihua. It's a little bit harder to read, so a lot of things I'm looking up here. But essentially what you're looking at is a Chinese translation of Stein's preliminary report from his first expedition. Stein finished his first expedition in 1901. He wrote an English language report, preliminary report of explorations in Khotan. A copy of the English language report was sent to the governor, Rao Yingqi, of Xinjiang in 1901. He immediately commissioned a Chinese translation of this because he was so interested in what Stein was doing in his province. And this is the translation by a man named Wan Rong. And in it, he actually discusses his own personal opinion of Stein. And this is what I would say is a form of political capital, as distinct from diplomatic capital. What do I mean by political capital? Wan Rong, basically, to summarize here, I have translations of the full thing in the book, but basically the summary of this is that he is telling his colleagues in the Chinese bureaucracy, this is for internal consumption, he's telling his colleagues in the Chinese bureaucracy, the Qing dynasty bureaucracy, that we should not be laughing at Stein. We Confucian gentlemen, we look down on, laboring with our hands, going into the freezing desert and doing these expeditions, getting our hands dirty. And he's saying, in fact, we should be emulating and admiring Stein. He is showing us the secrets of Western wealth and power. Right in front of us, we're seeing Western science on display in the form of Western archaeologists like Stein. And he actually tells his colleagues, stop laughing at Stein. We should be doing what Stein is doing. That is the source of Western wealth and power, and we need to emulate it. So there's so much more going on here than just archaeology. I see this as a form of political capital because they're using it as sort of a model with which to berate Qing officials in the bureaucracy. This is during the new policies era. We want to reform. We want to make China stronger again. Here is an example of how to do that right in front of our eyes, and it's a Western archaeologist. Next slide, please. Now, in addition to diplomatic and political capital, I also traced a lot of forms of what I would describe as social capital. Social capital. Here is a letter from a magistrate in Xinjiang, Wang Ming. He has just received a letter from Stein. Stein has written back to his father, who he had cultivated a friendship with on previous expeditions. And Wang Ming is writing back to say, sorry to inform you, but my father died before he read your letter. It's very sad. He would have loved to have seen your letter. And then he has this wonderful part in the letter in which he says, I remember every single time my father got together with his friends, he would change the topic and suddenly start discussing your expeditions. And he admired them and would talk about how brave you were and so many admirable things about them. What you're seeing, and I see it in many other letters as well, is the Chinese officials bragging about having met Stein. He is a form of a celebrity. All right, the archaeologists at that time, not today, but at that time, were seen to be doing things that no humans had ever done before. It was new, it was revolutionary, and apparently the Chinese officials oftentimes greatly admired it. Not only that, they bragged to their friends about it, much in the way that you and I would brag about having met a celebrity. Bragging, oh, I met Bill Gates at a business function or something like that. That's a form of social capital. In which we take that and we try to impress our friends with the people that we know. We name drop things. And here you're actually even seeing at one point in this letter, Wang Ming discusses what Stein has done, his career, in very familiar Chinese literary tropes. They're really thinking about them in terms of how they think about their own culture and history. At one point, he says, your books are so wonderful, they're so famous, that surely they must all sell out, and the situation is just like Luoyang zhi gui, a very famous phrase in Chinese. Surely the situation is like when paper became expensive in Luoyang, a reference to a famous Chinese poem from 1500 years ago that was so popular that paper ran out in the capital of Luoyang and no one could buy it. There's also economic capital. Next slide, please. Economic capital usually is for the lower classes, the laborers, the Muslim and Chinese peasants who were contracted to work on the expedition. And one of my best sources for this came from the Yale climatologist Ellsworth Huntington. I found that his perspective as one of the only Americans who did an expedition was very refreshing. He often would pay much closer attention to class distinctions that the Europeans often took for granted. And he comments much more openly on money, on the wages that he's paying, and the forms of compensation. And so I had the best example of the sort of scale of wages, whether or not are these good wages, are they bad wages, came from Ellsworth Huntington's letters in which he's comparing them to wages in America. And it's clear that the wages are usually quite generous, all right? So most of the lower classes, economically, they're getting economic capital. They're seeing this as an opportunity to improve their livelihood by working for a foreign expedition. Next slide. One of my favorite examples comes from the letter of Ellsworth Huntington. This photo that you're about to see is from Stein, but I want to show it because it's a rare group shot in which he's sitting with his assistants. He has his Indian assistants on the right, he has his Chinese secretary sitting to him to the left, and his Uyghur laborer Ibrahim Beg all the way on the left over there. And I just want to put this up as I read one of Huntington's letters in which he talks about another form of economic capital for his lower class laborers that was beyond simply wages. He says the following about a man named Daoud, a Uyghur guide named Daoud. And he says, when I met the governor, the Manchu governor of Xinjiang, a man by the name of Lian Kui, Huntington can easily get an audience with the governor because the Chinese officials very much value and admire the foreign explorers and they want to meet them. So then Huntington can then translate his access to powerful Chinese men into economic opportunities for his lower class peasants. Here is the excerpt from Huntington's diary. After asking Governor Lian Kui to give Daoud a village headman job as a beg, the governor promised to do so, and when he called on me, he asked to see the man. Poor Daoud, whom most horribly frightened, was brought in, and after falling on his knees at the door and bowing his close-shaven head to the ground half a dozen times, advanced nearer to be looked at. I suppose it was the great experience of his life, one that he will boast of till his death, for as Ibrahim said, another one of his assistants, a man like that could not procure a personal interview with the governor if he paid $5,000. You have the Uyghurs giving an exact monetary value to the value of the audience with the Chinese governor. And indeed, Daoud would end up getting many more promotions and different jobs over the next 10 years while working for foreign archaeologists. Now, I also spend a lot of time, next slide, I spend a lot of time trying to understand what value did the Chinese place on the art and antiquities that the foreigners removed. Didn't they regard these things as quite precious? And I'm not going to have time probably to go into as great a detail as I hope to here. We're getting a little, I think I only have about 5 minutes left. But I just sort of want to give you a general idea of what I found, is that the way that I say is that the Chinese officials placed a very high value on the art and antiquities that the foreigners were removing, but they did not regard them as priceless. All right, they regarded them as the privately owned reflection of their own personal virtue. All right, virtue is the sort of thing that Confucians often like to talk about. These were private possessions that were precious to them. Precious, and you see the version of Zhen Gui, Zhen, oftentimes being used to describe them. Very precious, but not priceless in the way that the foreign explorers had regarded them, all right? And so the difference between the two, the lower classes regard this stuff as profitable. You work for an expedition, you'll make some money. The Chinese officials regard them as precious. The Western scholars regard them as priceless. Next slide. And my case study for this was to look at the fate of the Dunhuang manuscripts from Cave 17, from the Secret Cave Library, and look at the ones that passed only through the hands of the Chinese officials. Next slide. Only the ones that passed through the hands of the Chinese officials. That is the ones that were not removed abroad. And what we find is that the Chinese officials treated these manuscripts from Cave 17 as their own personal reflection of their personal virtue. It was a form of political and social capital, and they would add colophons, tiba, to the end of these. They would insert themselves into the artifact, not like the Westerners, where they say this is a reflection of the glory of our empire and all the nations that it represents. It has to go behind a glass cabinet. It's priceless. It can never be transferred again. Next slide. slide. The Chinese adopted a very different way, idea of ownership here, in which this was something that was personally owned. You could add your own seal, you could add your own colophon, you could add your own comment to these things. Now we have delegitimized this practice, and we don't do this anymore. You can't write on a scroll, but the Qianlong Emperor could, and he did, quite copiously. Next slide. And so what I was looking at, I'm tracing all of the colophons on the Dunhuang manuscripts within China to understand how the Chinese interacted with them. They had colophon parties, is what I like to say, where they invite all their friends and everyone puts their little notation in here. They are impressing their friends with the manuscript that they have. Next slide. They also cut up manuscripts because these are privately owned, because they are seen as a transferable commodity. You can cut them up as well because you are creating additional capital to give to your friends, to impress your boss in the Chinese bureaucracy. And here you're seeing here where, Zhengxiang Ge Lie, all my friends competed to cut off their own portion of this Dunhuang manuscript. And I wanted to do that. I wanted to ingratiate myself with each one of my colleagues and people that I work for. Next slide. And I'm just going to go through this very, very quickly. I apologize, going a little bit over time. This is the same attitude that you saw from anyone who came of age during the late imperial era and had not yet received a westernized education. Puyi, when he's growing up in the Forbidden City, regards all the art and antiquities of the Forbidden City as his personal private possession. This reflects the virtue of my ancestors. They collected it. It's ours. And as a result, he sold it on the art market of Beijing to raise money to pay for the expenses of the Forbidden City. This is a practice he would continue to do. He was not alone. He's regarding it as the privately owned capital of his family, his personal family, the Ising Gyoro clan. Next slide. When does this all end? When does the attitudes change? As I show in my book, it's when the Chinese themselves become essentially westernized, in the sense that they start receiving a Western education. They're going abroad to Harvard, to Yale, to Oxford, and they are now being raised on the exact same way of looking at antiquities as the Westerners are, as symbols, priceless symbols of the nations, which now form the basis of political legitimacy for the new rulers of your state. Now they're priceless. Nothing can replace the political value of the artifacts that now are emblems of your state. And you can see in the 1920s, you get your first westernized generation of Chinese coming of age. They're wearing Western clothes. They have Western haircuts. Next slide. They adopt Western names. William Hung, he also has a Chinese name, obviously, Hong Ye. He becomes very famous for being the man who actually obstructs the very first Western expedition. Langdon Warner, Harvard art historian Langdon Warner, when he goes to Dunhuang, William Hung, who actually had studied at Harvard and was a professor at Yenjing University, very close ties to Harvard. He is the one who obstructs Warner, not a Chinese official who grew up with the civil service imperial exam and whatnot. It's someone who is from the exact same institution. It's a Harvard-educated Chinese official obstructing a Harvard professor, essentially, because they have the exact same valuation of the antiquities that are being removed. They're both priceless. Now it's going to be conflict. It's irreconcilable conflict. Next slide. I just have 2 more slides to go. Various elements that you have to have in place. You have to have your first westernized, educated generation of intellectuals has to come of age and have positions in government and in university. You have to have a national museum, and China gets its national museum finally when the Gugong, when the National Palace Museum in the Forbidden City finally opens its doors in 1925. It holds what are now regarded as the abstract symbols of the nation upon which political legitimacy now rests. They're priceless, and anyone who takes them is a thief. Anyone who takes them now is a thief. You are stealing from the Chinese nation. Next slide. This is the exact same view. The Chinese are now treating art and antiquities in exactly the same way that the Westerners had done ever since Napoleon in Egypt. They're not just profitable. They're not just precious. They are now a priceless, abstract symbol of the collective nation upon which political legitimacy now rests in the age of nationalism. Last slide, the very last slide. And so this is when you see the beginning of the obstruction of Western expeditions, the criminalization of the foreigners, who then respond with very ugly racist tropes in the 1930s. Here is an example that I found in the archives of Roy Chapman Andrews, the American paleontologist who went to Inner Mongolia, and those regions of China on his prehistorical expeditions. In his archives, I found this cartoon. It had been sent to him by Langdon Warner, the other American who had been obstructed by William Hong in 1925 at Dunhuang. They are making fun of the idea that anyone else could do what they once regarded as having a monopoly on. They're mocking the idea here in ugly racist tropes that anyone with dark skin who comes from a non-Western land could do these sort of expeditions, because everyone knows, in their mind, that only white men from civilized countries like Europe and America do expeditions. But this is actually belies the truth. The truth is, by this point, they have been obstructed throughout the world. And any independent country that has a generation of westernized local intellectuals that projects a priceless valuation on these art and antiquities, any one of those countries is now obstructing Westerners and regarding them as thieves. If they take things from the country, you have now stolen again from our nation. All right, thank you very much. I'll stop there. Obviously, I go into much greater detail in the book, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you have in the time remaining.
Thank you, Professor, for that speed talking presentation. I'm sorry we squeezed you into so little space, but you really did say a lot. I've had the benefit of having read the book, and I must say your book really helped me a lot to think clearly not only about this historical incident, but beyond them to our own times. So now we're going to move to some questions. Our first one is from Craig Clunas, and he asks, how aware were late Qing elites outside Xinjiang of Stein or Peleo's activities? Do their expeditions get into Chinese newspapers prior to 1911?
Yes, that's an excellent question. The earliest that we know that Chinese scholars on the eastern seaboard are aware of what's going on, Luo Zhenyu, the famous Qing scholar and antiquarian Luo Zhenyu, and his disciple, his student Wang Guowei, in 1909 is when, actually it's late 1908, early 1909, it's when Peleo, after he goes to Dunhuang, he then continues on to the eastern seaboard, and he meets with noted Qing dynasty scholars in Shanghai, Nanjing. I think he goes to Beijing as well, and they have a banquet for him, and that's when he actually shows them the Dunhuang manuscripts that he's found. And at that point, that's when Luo Zhenyu springs into action, and he begins to proactively acquire copies of the lectures, the printed lectures and speeches and articles that Peleo, Stein, and Otani Kozui, the Japanese archaeologist, are publishing in foreign languages, and he commissions translations of them. And those come out in 1909. Liu Sha Visiting the Ancients Among the Shifting Sands is the title of Luo Zhenyu's translation of the foreign reports. And so I would say that it's mid-1909 is when we know that scholars outside of the Northwest, not just Qing dynasty officials, scholars outside the Northwest are fully aware of what's going on, and they also try to get in on the action then. Luo Zhenyu is also the person who tries to get the Qing dynasty Ministry of Education to send a delegation to Dunhuang to take whatever remaining manuscripts might be in Cave 17.
Okay, our next question is from Patricia, and she asks, when did William Hong block the Harvard expedition?
So there were two Harvard expeditions, both led by Langdon Warner. First one was 1923 to 1924. He gets to Dunhuang in 1924. And the news of what he had done, he had peeled away about 8 of the paintings from the caves at the Mogao Grottos. News of what he had done is known. He actually didn't try to hide it himself. If you read Langdon Warner's letters, like I have for this research project, we find out that he told the Chinese officials at Dunhuang that he had removed the paintings. And according to him, the Chinese officials didn't seem to be too concerned about it. They only wanted to know, are there any more scrolls? Are there any more written documents in the cave? And he told them that he had taken these things. But word then trickles out again to the now westernized scholars on the eastern seaboard at Peking University, specifically like William Hong. And it's when Warner comes back in 1925 for a second expedition with much more ambitious plans. Now he is has actually brought artists with him, and the idea is to remove entire caves, the entire painting all over the cave, and then repaint it for the locals, who he thinks will be satisfied with a new copy. That's when William Hung and Yuan Fuli, actually. William Hung is the one who later gave a famous interview to a biographer in the late 1970s, and he gets all the credit, actually, for having obstructed Warner. And that's true. He did play a cardinal role in that. But also it was Yuan Fuli who had worked more closely with Johan Gunnar Andersson, the Swedish paleontologist. And Yuan Fuli behind the scenes also was instrumental in trying to basically tell local officials, this is what Warner did last time. This is no longer acceptable by our standards, and it's your job to make sure he doesn't do this again. And so it's 1925. 1925 is the first sort of clear instance of deliberate Chinese obstruction of a Western archaeological expedition.
Okay, our next question asks, given that Stein, Peleo, and Warner already saw ancient artifacts as priceless, why were they so outraged when modernized Chinese educators like Cai Yuanpei and the Beijing Commission to Preserve Antiquities began essentially to see it the same way?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the great ironies of history. What I found repeatedly over and over again, both among the archaeologists and their friends and colleagues that they exchanged letters with, is that they could not grasp that the Chinese were now basically mirror images of themselves. They have the exact same priceless value of these antiquities, and so they then begin to try to, smear them, to publicize pejorative views of them. We have these really ugly phrases that I found in many of the archaeologists' letters, in which they'll say, that the Chinese have an inferiority complex. They want us to do all the work, and then they take all the results. Roy Chapman Andrews once famously says, if I were to submit to Chinese demands, my expedition, we should just rename it Roy's Charity Expedition. Of course, we want to take things away. And they tried to denigrate the Chinese and basically said, these are returned Western students with a superficial veneer of Western education. They don't truly understand what they're doing. They don't have the capacity to preserve this stuff. We are still the ones that are best qualified to do it. One of the great ironies is that they simply cannot see and cannot respect mostly the fact that the Chinese are now educated in precisely the same way that they're educated, want to preserve these things just like the Westerners, but the preservation is going to occur in China now. It's not going to occur in Western museums, and that's basically unacceptable. They know that you can't get money for an expedition if you don't bring back things that can be placed on a glass cabinet back home for your patrons to be able to show off their cultural enlightenment in a museum.
Thanks for that. Next question is from Tina McFarlane. She asks, have you had a reaction from those who want their antiquities back from Western museums, such as the British Museum?
The book is quite new. It just came out in July. It came out during the pandemic. So no, I actually haven't had any reactions from anyone who is advocating for the return of these sort of things yet. I have had a preliminary reaction from a few Chinese scholars who got a hold of the book, and apparently there's an interest in translating it into Chinese, which I really hope does happen, because I think that'll help facilitate a very necessary conversation. And I see my role in this. My role, hopefully, as a historian, is that I really hope that I can resist trying to take sides and say, one way or the other, this does belong here, or it does belong here, or it should be given back. What I'm hoping is that when we have these conversations, which we absolutely should be having, that we can simply have a more accurate understanding of the original context in which things were removed. What I've often found in doing the research is that the reflexive assumption is that coercion, corruption, were responsible. Coercion, corruption, and deceit were responsible for these things being crossing borders and being removed from their countries of origin. And sometimes that's the case. I'm not trying to say that's not always the case, but I found that far more often the people who are involved in these expeditions, in the removal of these things, seem to be doing so not only voluntarily, but also enthusiastically. And so I just want to make sure that when we have these conversations, we have that they're based on a more accurate understanding of what all the available source material can tell us about the original context, the motivations of everyone that was involved, and how these motivations have changed over time.
Great. Let's just take one more question. Someone writes, can't wait to read the book. Could you perceive any ethnic awareness in Stein's dealings with Manchu officials on one hand and local Uyghur and Kazakhs on the other hand?
Ethnic consciousness, I'm not quite sure what the question's getting at, but I mean, he's clearly aware that these people are different and come from different cultural backgrounds. He has his own prejudices. Most of the foreign archaeologists tend to identify with the Chinese officials. They see them as, very similar to them in being civilized people who also rule over what to them are deemed culturally inferior people. The fact that the Chinese are rulers was something that the foreigners respected. Oh, they rule over inferior people just like we do in our own empires. And so the Uyghurs, the Kazakhs were generally seen in that framework. These are the people who are ruled over by the Chinese. We're at the pinnacle of the hierarchy of the world. The Chinese are sort of right below us. They once were up here in antiquity. Now they're like here. And the Uyghurs and Kazakhs are down here because they're being ruled by a slightly inferior ruler. And so they tend, they're aware that there are different peoples in China and whatnot, but they place them fairly down on the social and political hierarchy and basically echo similar views that the Chinese have. I remember specifically in Stein's diary, he repeatedly, in his letters and diaries, he repeatedly denigrates the Tibetans. He had some sort of thing against the Tibetans. Every time he finds Tibetan ruins, Tibetan documents and whatnot, he always has to say something about how the Tibetans are the dirtiest of all the people who have left remains in the archaeological record. I always thought that was odd. He really goes out of his way time and time again to denigrate Tibetans whenever he finds something. No, it's interesting. You can actually get at a lot of the prejudices of the time. The Chinese officials, oftentimes, Stein will report them as denigrating the Tibetans, always saying, oh, you can't go there. There's wild Tibetans will ambush you, Tibetan bandits and whatnot. Yes, many of the ethnic prejudices are definitely on display. But they generally respected the Chinese officials as fellow fraternal colleagues of their own empire. Their empire has fallen a little bit, but it's still an empire like us, and they are rulers of inferior peoples, and that makes us more similar than dissimilar.
Well, since you've spoken so fast, we do still have some time before our hour is up, so if you don't mind taking a couple more questions. There's one from Greg Thomas, and he asks, does the new PRC government take a different view of this kind of cultural heritage starting in 1949? 1950.
So after the PRC era, after 1949, you get an effort. I mean, it goes. Every Maoist campaign really changes the what's going on at the time. But generally speaking, there was a wonderful dissertation written on this in the last decade that shows that the PRC actively tried to find the things that Puyi had sold from the Forbidden City during the 19-teens and the 1920s, and was quite successful in repurchasing many of them. They tried to get new donations, and sometimes they coerced donations of Chinese who had substantial private collections, and their goal was to restock the Forbidden City, essentially, and to restock many areas that had been plundered for various reasons, sometimes actual plunder from wars and whatnot. They were quite successful by the end of the 1950s, I believe. Obviously, you have the Cultural Revolution, but even during the Cultural Revolution, the Forbidden City was one of the very few sites that Zhou Enlai basically said, no, no Red Guards are getting in here. I believe they did get in once, but he was able to limit the damage. There aren't too many places that Zhou Enlai went out of his way to make sure that they didn't attack. The nuclear test site in Lop Nur in Xinjiang and the Forbidden City were the two that were very high priority for him, that they shouldn't be desecrated in any way. Now, since the reform and opening up era, Deng Xiaoping in the last 30 years or so, 40 years really now, I guess, they're seeing the attitude towards art and antiquities, I think, is essentially the same as it was from that first generation of westernized Chinese intellectuals in the 1920s, like William Hung. They are now emblems of the eternal Chinese nation, and as such, they are the basis of political legitimacy, and they're priceless. They're not transferable anymore, like those Dunhuang manuscripts were when we saw with their colophons. They are non-transferable as emblems of the nation, and their rightful place is supposed to be just like what the Westerners do, behind a glass cabinet in a museum to educate the masses about their glorious ancient heritage.
Okay, I think that's it for. I do have one last question, if you don't mind.
No problem.
Since we're talking about these political agendas, there are still political agendas in the use of antiquities by the governments, such as the mainland right now. So, in our kind of post-truth era, do people really? How much will the truth of the history behind these things really matter to people if they're already sort of committed to identifying with these artifacts as priceless?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I tend to be on the cynical side of the historical spectrum, and I don't have any great hope that we'll have a more nuanced understanding in the public sphere. When it gets down to political agendas in the public sphere, yeah, people have pretty much decided what they already believe, and they will construct an argument that caters to their own institutional interests. And so generally speaking, unless you have irrefutable documented evidence of, nefarious means that were used to remove something, and it was clearly, oh, this is plunder. This was absolutely plunder. Museums, Western museums, will find very lofty, beautiful sounding arguments to try to justify the retention of every single thing that is in their museum. Their institutional livelihood essentially depends on it. They have to construct those arguments and find a way to make it sound really nice. And on the other side, those countries where you now have the exact same view that these are emblems of your nation, political legitimacy rests on that. So this is now theft from our nation, and if we are the stewards of the nation as the new politicians, we have to protect it and pursue these things. They will come up also with very nuanced and sophisticated arguments. I often like to say that if there weren't good arguments on both sides, the debate would have ended a long time ago. And 100 years ago or 50 years ago, basically, if the arguments were really good on one side and the other side had no sophisticated, nuanced arguments, everything would have been returned or nothing would have been returned. But the fact that both sides can draw upon a large body of historical evidence and kind of select things that are useful for their agenda means that quite eloquent arguments can be made on both sides for why things should be returned or should not be returned.
Thank you so much for your speed talking and delivering so much information packed into 1 hour. And thank you all for joining us today. I hope you'll come back and see our series with Peter Lam, brought to you by our president, Tina Pang. And also, just one final note, I want to give a big thanks to our administrator, Sebastian Turner, for all his hard work helping to move our lectures online and into the 21st century. We hope to see you all again soon. Thank you very much, Professor Jacobs.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.